think what I'm going to do today is talk to you about what I'm calling 7 major turning points in the history of Christian engagement in social reform and political activity in America. And I know what you want to get into is more practical, contemporary conversation about how we can think strategically about making a difference as Christians in the social and political realm today. But I think if you give me just 15 minutes to talk about some history, the history itself can inform our strategy for making a difference in politics today in ways that will make us more effective, I believe, than if we ignore our history. So I think what I'm going to do is just read turning point by turning point and then give you some color commentary on each of the turning points and try to get through all of it by 15 minutes from now, and then leave us with some table questions for discussion, and I'll stick around and participate in that discussion as well. I have some takeaways that maybe I'll want to contribute when it's group time, but I'll save those for the end of our time together today. All right, so 7 major turning points that shape the realities we face today as Christians who want to make a difference for Christ in the social and the political realm. First one, the disestablishment of the colonial era churches and the shift from top down to bottom up Christian socio-cultural influence. This was the era of the death of Christendom. I know I got a lot of big words in there. I'll explain it in a second. After which Christians looked bad for having promoted Christian values by military coercion and legal force. Have you heard about Christendom before? You've heard people use that word, and you've heard probably the word disestablishment before, but you may have wondered what it meant. The point I'm making here is that right around 1800, most of the formally, legally established churches in America were disestablished. In the Middle Ages and the early modern period, especially in Europe, especially among white European Christians, there was a tendency to spread the gospel, to spread Christianity by taking over other people's territory and imposing Christianity on that territory from the top down. Now that's a kind of a blunt way of saying it. There'd be more subtle and sophisticated ways of saying it, but for the purpose of time, I think it's important for us to remember that, and remember that in our own country's history, right about the year 1800, all of the denominations that were officially sponsored and established by law in the colonial period were decoupled from the government, were disestablished. So of the 13 original colonies of the U.S., 9 of them had officially established state churches. And all of those churches were disconnected from the government after the Revolutionary War. The last state to disestablish its official denomination was Massachusetts. The congregational churches in Massachusetts were established by law. People had to pay tax money to support them, and the values preached in them had a kind of a top-down influence on American moral, social, political life. And that came to an end with disestablishment about the time of 1800. And Christians had to find new voluntary, bottom-up ways of witnessing and making a difference in the social, political realm. All right, so that's turning point 1, disestablishment and the slow death of that Christendom model for witnessing and spreading the gospel and spreading the Christian faith around the world. Turning point number 2 follows on turning point number 1. The rise of the evangelical righteous empire, as the scholars like to call it. In the early and middle decades of the 19th century, this is the 1800s, mainly white, we're not only going to talk about white people, but in the early history it's important to remember a lot of the stuff that's happening is being led by white men, mainly. In the early and middle decades of the 19th century, mainly white Protestant men led American public culture through what scholars call mediating structures. What are mediating structures? They're social groups and associations that lie between individuals and the state. Mid-range institutions. which for most of the 19th century were as big as the federal government, which was much smaller than it is today. Last year, our United States federal government had a budget of $3.8 trillion. In the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it was nothing like that. The government was small, and if you add up the annual budgets of all these mediating institutions, these parachurch Christian organizations, through which a lot of Christians were trying to make a difference in social reform and American politics, their budgets were more than, they spent more money than the government of the United States. There were many Christian women involved in this kind of social activism, especially in the anti-slavery and temperance and missions movements, and I have some of the women listed there for you. Black freedmen were also involved, especially in anti-slavery, though usually on the radical fringe of the so-called righteous empire, criticizing the tepid, gradualistic, slow approach to anti-slavery of most white Christians. And I list some of the most famous African-American leaders from the period there. Sometimes this kind of activism affected American politics, most importantly the politics of slavery, through the work of the Liberty Party and the Free Soil parties. The political party system was different back then than it is today. And these two parties, the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party, were full of radical Christians trying to make a difference politically through them. But usually, these activists worked outside of and rivaled the American political process, solving problems with what we've come to call parachurch agencies and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So after the churches were disestablished, after everybody had to go to church, after everybody had to pay tax money to support the values of the churches, ministers and denominational leaders and Christians who wanted to make a difference were looking for these new bottom-up voluntary ways to spread the Christian message. And more often than not, before the Civil War, they did so through these mediating, parachurch kinds of organizations. And one thing I want us to remember later on is that a lot of white evangelicals today still have that kind of influence in mind when they think about what it means to influence social reform and politics in America. And that makes sometimes for some tension between white evangelical Christians and Christians of color when it comes to thinking about how we work together and what our goals are. All right, so that's turning point number 2. Turning point number 3, liberal Protestant ascendancy in the mainstream public culture of the US and the so-called evangelical Great Reversal. This was facilitated by the massive growth of our cities, the rise of social science, and the inability of the old parachurch groups to cope with the new scale of American social challenges as well as other Christians did. It allowed theologically liberal Protestants to take the lead in new top-down efforts at social change, urban planning, and the rise of government-sponsored social welfare programs, which really pick up for the first time in American history in the late 1800s. So what's this great reversal? In the 1960s and the 1970s, a lot of Christian scholars who bemoaned the Great Reversal gave it this name. And their argument was, whatever happened to progressive evangelical social action? Before the Civil War, mainly through these parachurch, NGO-type mediating institutions, evangelicals were usually the ones out front when it came to social reform, social change, social activism. By the late 19th century, though, there was a great reversal in most evangelical attitudes about social change. This is associated in a lot of history scholarship with the rise of a certain kind of eschatology, dispensational premillennialism, which taught people increasingly over the course of the 1800s, the world is getting worse and worse. It's ultimately going to be destroyed. And the job of Christians is to save people out of the world, to pull them out of the world through salvation and bring them into the church. And with this kind of mindset, a lot of Christians who formerly would have been really excited about being out front in social reform, political activity, social change, now were happy to kind of fall to the background and let more liberal Protestants be in charge of the out front, top-down social change. This is the period of time of the rise of the social gospel movement. Have you heard of the social gospel movement? Some evangelical Christians were involved in the social gospel movement, but the most famous social gospel leaders tended to be liberal white Protestants. There are also some black and female, it's not only liberal white Protestants, but I keep saying this because I want us to see part of our legacy is a lot of kind of funny, guilty feelings that white Protestants have had and that they're still dealing with when we think about social change, political activity today. And I think some of this history can help us to understand that better. All right, so that's the great reversal. Turning point number 4, African American activism and the decline of Jim Crow. This was mainly, though not exclusively, bottom-up change based in congregations, with black churches taking the lead. But by the 1960s especially, it was top-down too. You don't get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which put an end to a lot of the Jim Crow obstacles to black voting rights, without some top-down political witness and activity. Tensions emerged among African American church leaders between those who preferred Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee machine and those more interested in protest on a local and national scale, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the NAACP, and later, the leaders of the other major civil rights groups, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, which was multi-ethnic and interreligious, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was led early on by Martin Luther King Jr., the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC or SNCC, which was mainly secular but had some Christian involvement. All right, so African Americans, after the Civil War, are understandably trying to make a big difference in social life, political activity in America. Early on, the places from which they could make the biggest difference were churches, because even though the Reconstruction movement after the Civil War enabled many of them to become politicians, Reconstruction came to an end pretty quickly under white racist influence. So over the course of the 20th century, it's black churches that are kind of the main base of operation for what comes to be the civil rights movement in the middle decades of the 20th century. And even within those churches, there are pastors disagreeing with one another about how much protesting and political activity to be involved in, and how much sort of keep to ourselves, keep our noses down, get involved in building businesses and education, and the kinds of things that are less controversial, on the other hand. Probably the most famous example of this is in the National Baptist Church. There was a big division by the middle of the 20th century between a conservative leader named Joseph Jackson, who was the head of the National Baptist Convention for several decades, and a younger, up-and-coming group of politically progressive African-American Baptist pastors, led by people like Martin Luther King Jr., Gardner Taylor, Ralph Abernathy, many of the people who become the out-front leaders of the civil rights movement, struggled for control of the National Baptist Convention in the 50s and 60s, and formed the Progressive National Baptist Church as a result of their inability to effect the kind of political activism and change in the National Baptist Convention that they were after. Some of you have had history classes where you've learned Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee machine. He's based in Tuskegee. There's a historically black university in Tuskegee now. Washington's approach was more conservative. He wanted less protest, more education, more black industry, more black businesses, etc. And over time, that became controversial because other African American citizens didn't want to wait as long as Washington seemed to be willing to wait for the end of Jim Crow. And they wanted to fight more at a national, highly publicized level. Right? So there's a major turning point in U.S. American history when it comes to thinking about how to affect social change and be involved in political activity. Turning point number 5, backside of the handout. There's related civil rights work going on among Latinos and Latinas. The most influential of these were the pecan sheller strikes in San Antonio, Texas, in the late 1930s, which were led by a woman, a Catholic Latina woman named Emma Tenayuca, and then the farm workers movement in both California and Texas during the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, which were led by a Catholic man named Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez is kind of famous. There was a biopic done on him a couple years ago that's really good. So if you want to get a feel for the farm workers movement and what Cesar Chavez was like, that'd be a good movie to watch. There's a little bit of scholarship on this activity. There's a woman named Arlene Sanchez Walsh who teaches at Azusa Pacific University, who's written on the pecan shellers strikes and Latino-Latina Christian, explicitly Christian activism in the 20th century. And there's a white Lutheran pastor named Alan Watt in Pennsylvania who's written some helpful stuff on the role of Christians in the farm workers movement. Most of the Latinos who were part of the farm workers movement were Catholic migrants from Mexico and places farther south. The Latino civil rights efforts paralleled pretty evenly African American civil rights efforts in that most of the time, more often than not, there was not a whole lot of white Christian support for what was going on. There was not a whole lot of Christian congregational participation in the civil rights movement. There's some, so we don't want to say there was none, but there wasn't a whole lot. And oftentimes, in the Latino case, the most significant support for civil rights came, when it came from whites, it came from union leaders who would help the farm workers by siding with them and striking with them, and so on. All right, turning point number 6. White evangelical re-engagement, mainly on the right, which is what you see on TV every day, but with a smaller interracial group on the left. In the 1940s and 50s, neo-evangelical leaders, this is post-fundamentalist period evangelical leaders, such as Carl F.H. Henry, who was connected with our school, called Christians to re-engage and make a difference in society and politics. Some who responded leaned to the left on American political issues. For example, Ron Sider, John Perkins, Richard Mao, William Pennell. These are both white and black people. William Bentley, Jim Wallace, and other drafters and signatories of the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. If you've not read that document, you should. It's a very famous document written by evangelicals in the 70s who were interested in making a difference in society and politics. It hasn't made nearly as big a difference in Christian activity as it should have. And you can find it on the web really easily. That document denounced American racism and militarism. This is a Vietnam War era document. And called for social justice. But most of these new evangelical leaders who were following Dr. Henry in calling for and getting involved in social and political change leaned to the right, resisting the further liberalization and secularization of America, especially with respect to sexual ethics and the freedom of religion. Many on the right began to call one another to take back America. That's a phrase you've heard a few times in recent weeks, right? But forgot that the heyday of white evangelical Protestants was one in which bottom-up, righteous empire-style efforts at social change had prevailed. So in recent years, you've got this irony of whites on the right seeking to run America's moral life from the top down again. And then you've got tragedy on the left, because this older kind of interracialism didn't work very well or last very long. I bet a lot of you never even heard of this Chicago Declaration that I'm telling you about, and don't remember some of the names on this list. Ron Sider's an old man who's in charge of Evangelicals for Social Action. He's still around. He's based in Philadelphia. He's doing very good work on behalf of progressive evangelicals interested in society and politics. Of course, everybody's heard of John Perkins, African-American leader based in Mendenhall, Mississippi. Richard Mao, who has most recently been the president of Fuller Seminary, was one of these signatories. Bill Pannell was a Wesleyan African-American minister based in California, a Fuller Seminary grad, and a Fuller Seminary professor, who they just named a center after for African-American church life and reconciliation work at Fuller Seminary. William Bentley is a name you should know, but I bet you don't. He's one of the black founders of the National Black Evangelical Association. Very influential minister in this period of time. And Jim Wallace is pretty famous. He's also a TEDS grad. Okay, seventh and final turning point. As you've sensed, these are going in chronological order, and we're kind of coming up to the present day here. Christian Gen Xers and millennials shake things up, creating new configurations of religious social change and reversing the Great Reversal in a pan-evangelical way. The evangelical left has clearly grown and become younger during the past quarter century. It has enjoyed more leadership from African American, Asian American, and Latina Christians. It has demonstrated greater interest in multicultural efforts to effect social change. Its constituents still usually oppose abortion, but provide less support for traditional views of marriage than their forebears did. It includes many people who are conservative theologically, but moderate to liberal politically. And this rise of this new evangelical left is getting a lot of attention from scholars these days. Probably the book that I would recommend if you're interested in this is by a man named David Swartz, who's a Christian, teaches at Asbury, called Moral Minority, that charts the history, and there's sort of a play on words there. It's the theologically conservative but politically liberal evangelical, sort of a counterpart to the moral majority, most of whom are in the Republican Party. And there's a famous sociologist at Notre Dame named Christian Smith, who has argued in recent years that again today, evangelicals tend to be out in front when it comes to social change and political activity. Most famously in the Republican Party, but also in the Democrat Party as well. And so, Smith is arguing, the Great Reversal has itself been reversed. And maybe we're entering into a new day when Christians can come together and make a difference, even at a national level, and certainly at more regional levels, in social change and political action. One of my friends, who's also a friend of Dr. Cha, Seung-Chan Rah, has also written a couple of important books on this new kind of evangelical social witness. His most famous one is called The Next Evangelicalism. In his view, the next evangelicalism is going to be much more obviously colorful and multicultural than most people assume evangelicalism is or has been in recent decades. And he's got a new book coming out in a couple of months called Return to Justice, in which he's advocating for this kind of number 7 evangelical change-making in America and other parts of the world as well. All right, so that's just 7 turning points. It's a little history for you that I think can inform the way we process together what it is we want to do, what it is we're after as we work together, and sometimes separately as well, to make a difference with respect to social reform and politics in America. So thanks very much for listening.